Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Reclaiming Real Religious Freedom, the First Amendment Significance for Jewish Women. My name is Katie Reiter, and I am the National Program Coordinator for Jews for a Secular Democracy, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. Before we start, I have a little bit of housekeeping and several thank yous. We have enabled closed captioning, so if you desire them, please turn them on your own Zoom. We will be taking questions for the panelists at the end of the program through the chat function. Paul Golan, who's the Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, will be moderating the chat and helping us with questions at the end. This webinar is the kickoff event for a multi-year project in Florida on Jewish women and religious freedom. Please mark your calendars now for our second webinar in this project on October 17th. That webinar will take the information from tonight and bring it to the ground level. What is happening on the ground in Florida to Jewish women, their partners, their families, and communities due to the violations of religious freedom in Florida. We will then continue this learning journey with an in-person conference on December 3rd. Look for more information coming shortly. While this project is focused on Florida, we believe this webinar and future programming is very important and relevant to everyone. What happens in Florida matters to us all. So before we get started, I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Horizon for their grant support of this entire project. I also want to thank the 9 co-sponsors of today's webinar: the Society for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Broward County, Congregation Beth Adam, Florida National Organization for Women, Greater Orlando National Organization for Women, National Council of Jewish Women Greater Miami Section, RAC Florida, Keshet, and Temple Israel of Orlando. Plus, I want to express my sincere and personal appreciation to all 20 plus members of the Florida Steering Committee who have worked diligently with me to plan this webinar and are currently working on planning the rest of our entire project. Their names are going to be posted on the project's landing page, which should be up and running on Jews for a Secular Democracy's website very shortly. And also, finally, I want to say to all of you who are being impacted or about to be impacted by the hurricane, we are thinking of you all, and we are hoping you are all safe. If you have to sign off early or if you lose power, this webinar is being recorded, and I will be sending out a link later, so don't worry. Our thoughts and well wishes are all of you. And now, let's move on to what you all came here for. First, to introduce our tonight's esteemed panelist is a key member of the Jewish Women and Religious Freedom Project Steering Committee who has been immensely helpful in putting this webinar together, Laura Rodriguez. Laura currently serves as the Florida State Policy Advocate for the National Council on Jewish Women. She is the chair of Pro-Truth Florida, which is an NCJW campaign to expose fake clinics. She is the chair of Courts Matter Florida Coalition, and she is a past president and current board member of the Greater Miami section of NCJW. She is also never late for a chocolate chip cookie with milk. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you all for being here. And as Katie said, my thoughts are with all of you affected by the storm. I'm just going to briefly introduce all of our panelists for today. First is Rabbi Amy Morrison. She's an East Lansing, Michigan native, is well known throughout South Florida for her passionate outreach to our diverse, multi-generational community. She is especially renowned for her youth, young professional, and LGBTQ plus programming and advocacy. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Michigan in 2000, a master's degree in Hebrew letters in 2006, as well as a rabbinic ordination in 2008 from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles, California. Rabbi Morrison is currently working on her master's in gerontology from the University of Southern California, as well as an executive certificate in religious fundraising from the University of Indiana. The rabbi also holds a certificate in pastoral care and counseling from Emory University and is currently serving as a hospice chaplain for Accent Care Hospice throughout South Florida. Prior to her hospice residency, Rabbi Morrison was the senior rabbi at Temple Israel of Greater Miami from 2018 to 2023, as well as serving on the clergy team at Temple Beth Shalom on Miami Beach from 2011 to 2018. Nationally and locally noted for her innovative and provocative approach to creating meaningful, engaging, and relevant prayer experiences, Rabbi Morrison has been featured in the New York Times, the Miami Herald, Sun Sentinel, as well as Elle magazine. Alongside her son Ezra, Rabbi Morrison joyfully serves the interfaith community of South Florida as an educator, advocate, motivator, and change agent. Next on our list of distinguished speakers is Dr. Rachel Kranson. Dr. Rachel Kranson is a professor of religious studies and director of Jewish studies at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a core member of the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program. She is the author of Ambivalent Embrace, Jewish Upward Mobility in Post-War America, and an editor of A Jewish Feminine Mystique, Jewish Women in Post-War America, a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Her writing on Jews, gender, and sexuality has appeared in top academic journals, as well as popular venues such as the Washington Post, Tikkun, and Lilith magazine. Dr. Kranson's forthcoming book, Religious Misconceptions, focuses on the history of Jewish engagement in national debates over abortion. And last but not least, Kara Gross is the Legislative Director and Senior Policy Counsel of the ACLU of Florida. She advocates for statewide legislation and policies defending and advancing civil rights and liberties across ACLU's priority issue areas, including criminal justice reform, immigrants' rights, voting rights, reproductive justice, LGBTQ plus rights, First Amendment protections, and freedom of speech. Prior to joining the ACLU of Florida, she served as Senior Assistant General Counsel for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Prior to that, she was an Associate Director of Legal Programs at a statewide nonprofit domestic violence advocacy organization. Kara currently serves on the board of the RBG Fund, a Tallahassee nonprofit dedicated to supporting abortion access, and previously served on the board of HERC, the Holocaust Education and Resource Council. She received her JD magna cum laude from Brooklyn Law School and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Washington University. Kara is admitted to practice law in Florida, New York, New Jersey, and the Supreme Court. With all of that, I give it back to you, Katie. I can't wait to hear from everyone.
Okay, this is where I don't like webinars because I want everyone to clap. That is an amazing panel. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Laura, for your introduction and for really working on this. We are going to run this webinar in a question and answer format. I'll ask each panelist a few fundamental questions. Panelists, please try to keep your answers to 10 minutes or less so that we can have 10 to 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. Okay, let's get started, and let's start with the basics. Ms. Gross, as an ACLU attorney, please tell me more about the legal notion of religious freedom. What exactly does religious freedom mean in the United States? What does our Constitution say about religious freedom? And what does it mean in our modern society?
Wow, those are big questions. First, I just want to thank you all for having me here. And I'm honored to be on this panel and to be with you all tonight. And thank you for taking this time out of your evening, especially with this pending storm. Really appreciate being here with all of you. So these are some very big questions and ones that we could spend hours talking about and debating and dissecting. At its most basic, its core, religious freedom is the freedom to have and to hold and to practice your religious beliefs, or to not have or hold or practice any religious beliefs at all. It's the freedom to worship as you choose or not at all, and to do so free from government intrusion. Religious freedom is a fundamental right. It is grounded in our First Amendment of the Constitution, and it is the right to practice religion or no religion at all. It's among the most fundamental of the freedoms guaranteed in our Bill of Rights. A little history here is adopted in 1791 with the Bill of Rights. And our country's founders, they knew from the very beginning that the best way to protect religious liberty was to keep the government out of religion. So what exactly is the First Amendment? What does it exactly say about religion? It's pretty straightforward, and it's concise, and it has a huge body of case law, and it's really just one sentence. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so a couple things I'll note about the language. Even though it says Congress shall make no law, the First Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court as applying to the entire federal government, even though it is only expressly applicable to Congress. Furthermore, the court has interpreted the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment as protecting the rights in the First Amendment from interference by state governments as well. So let's break down this one sentence and all of what it means. So the First Amendment actually has two explicit provisions that are guaranteeing freedom of religion. The first part, as I'm sure many of you, all of you know, is the Establishment Clause, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And this was written to make sure that the government would not establish or promote or endorse or finance or encourage any particular religious belief or symbols. It ensures that the government shall not establish an official religion or prefer or favor one religion over another. It enforces what is commonly referred to as the separation of church and state. However, as I'm sure we'll talk about later, we are seeing a severe eroding of this separation of church and state in recent years, and this devastating erosion is happening at exponential speed in the past few years. The second part of the First Amendment is referred to as the Free Exercise Clause, and this guarantees the right to practice one's religion free of government interference. So the ACLU and everyone here and all of the partners that are committed to religious freedom, we all are working to make sure that government does not promote particular religious beliefs or activities, and also to vigilantly defend America's freedom to practice their own religious beliefs. And so religious freedom in its most basic is the freedom of and the freedom from religion. And the Constitution does not endorse any specific religious creed. It does not recognize any power of government to decide theological questions. The right to practice religion or no religion at all is among the most fundamental of freedoms guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. I will go a little further just to talk about a little bit of what this means in our modern society, because I think that was one of the questions as well. So, we at the ACLU, since the beginning of its foundation, has been working on these issues, and we're actually involved in the very early 1925 Scopes monkey trial, which had to do with the teaching of evolution. I'm sure everybody remembers that. But the thing about that I want to mention here is that, this set off alarm bells for the country in 1925 about religious instruction in schools and about the need to separate church from state. Now, in that case, because it was 1925 and because of the way it was brought, we actually lost, and Scopes was actually found guilty and fined. But other than that, there was a huge win in the eyes of the American public, and in the hearts and minds of the importance of separation of church and state. It took another few decades for the Supreme Court to actually recognize that separation of church and state in 1968, that such teachings of evolution actually violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But for decades, this doctrine of separation of church and state has become widely accepted and uncontroverted. So, everybody knows, separation of church and state. That just seems so clear and so obvious, and something we all know exists and is foundational. The problem, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is that not everybody thinks that way or believes that way, and thinks that the separation of state and church should actually be a thing that we value here in the United States, despite the Constitution. So fast forward to the present day, where our freedom of religion is being completely upended, such that we are living in an upside down world where the First Amendment and religious freedom is now being twisted and contorted to justify discrimination and bigotry under the guise of religious freedom. So it is an exact opposite of what we had seen and what so readily recognized as this separation of church and state. We are now seeing the diminishment of that separation. And in fact, the supermajority of the US Supreme Court engaging in a concerted effort to eliminate this separation of church and state. So with that, I will stop and we will talk more later.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very interesting. And welcome to everybody who just joining us. We're just getting started, so you're good. I want to take the next question to Rabbi Morrison. Rabbi, I want to move this to what does it mean to the Jewish community? What does religious freedom mean to the Jewish community? Why should it be important? Why is it important, or why should it be important to Jewish women and their families and their communities?
So first, I just want to thank Kara. I learned a great deal. Being on the pulpit, being on the bima, we don't hear it in such legal terms. Separation of church and state to me is very clear because we're a 501c3. I cannot talk politics from the bima. But besides that, I never really see the two worlds crossing because Judaism is such a progressive religion in the sense where it is almost seamless, or has been until very recent times, where human rights are Jewish rights and women's rights are Jewish rights. And it was very easy to speak about them from a Jewish lens and not cross into First Amendment, even though it was okay, to support that in that way. Judaism is based on the understanding that even our name comes from the fact that we must wrestle, that we have to be the people who wrestle with the understanding of God, with any dogma that's put forward, with any law that is placed, whether it's law Bashamayim, law like of Torah law, or really law of the land. And so to think about how we are taught to wrestle becomes very much in the spotlight when it talks about the First Amendment. Church and state, even in its name, is innately not Jewish. Right. I understand that when my child goes to school, there are plenty of subtleties and nuanced comments that are very much church and state blended together. But in that sense, they are Christian. They are church and state that come together. So in the Jewish community, I think that we have always done, whether it's positive or negative in the long run, we've always done a great deal of isolating and of insulating so that our people are together and that we learn together. We have certain eating rituals so that that is consistent. The beginning of kashrut, of keeping kosher, was so that we weren't the other, so that we did things differently. The understanding of our liturgy being in a different language, of a lot of our liturgy having to do with questioning even the belief of God, is so that we are not the mainstream, so we are not the other. And so I think Judaism has always, whether they know it or not, really preached there is no place for politics within our religion. But I think that it has caused us, some of that isolation has caused within Judaism, especially the different movements of Judaism, its own political challenges. I'm not confused that it benefits us to not mix church and state because the church there is the Christian church predominantly. But I think that we have always had that within our narrative of being Jews. I think we have always had to other ourselves. And in that othering, we've had to collect within each other kind of a Jewish identity. In terms of women specifically, Katie, I think, again, when women's rights was going on, when voting rights were going on, Jews were standing at the ballots, were standing arm in arm with women. We were with Martin Luther King. I mean, I think that Jewish women really understand that, the phrase bella busta, like that we have the cojones, we have the guts, the women. In our culture, women are supposed to speak up and we are supposed to advocate, and we are not 5 steps behind our husbands for any other reason than our role is defined differently, not subservient, not less than, but that we have different roles. And one of those roles is to speak up on behalf of our families. And so I think that part of my job being a rabbi is to remind women that we have to speak out. We can never be complacent. And as Jews, we're told to never stand idly by. And so when it comes to things like pursuing democracy, but also keeping it out of our synagogue, keeping the legalities out of our synagogue, I speak a great deal about going out and voting and going out and advocating and going out and making sure that people understand and are knowledgeable about all the issues, so that as Jewish women, we can be educated and go out and educate others. So I think it's incredibly important, not just for the women within Judaism, but for the individual Jewish people to understand all of the different dynamics going on so that they can educate others. I think that it's not lost on any of us that this is a faith of education. And the more we become educated, the more we have allies like the ACLU, like so many of the actually sponsors today, the more we can sit at the same table of people who think differently from us and have a conversation that's mutual so that we can move to a place where, we're really getting things done. My style is much more conversational. I'm not a lecturer. I wish that I had that skill set that the other 2 panelists have, but I look forward to hearing the questions from the group later on.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I appreciate that. We're going to move now to Dr. Kranson. And I know a few of you joined late, so I will try to put some of the bio information in the chat as Dr. Kranson is speaking so that everybody can kind of see who these amazing panelists are that we have. Dr. Kranson.
Hi, everyone.
Related to, I want to go back to what the first 2 panelists were talking about, religious freedom. What would you say are policy and legal issues that are related to religious freedom? And in what way have Jewish people historically engaged in the fight for religious freedom? And then I have an additional question. Can you kind of particularly address the fight for reproductive freedom? I know that's one of your special areas. And is that a religious freedom area, and why?
Fantastic. Thanks for these questions. Thank you to my panelists also for setting up my comments so well. And again, thank you to everyone who's taking time out of their evening to learn about this. So it should come as a surprise to no one that American Jews have a very long history of fighting for First Amendment rights. From the 1940s through the 1960s in particular, the lawyers who represented American Jewish organizations were some of the strongest advocates for a very strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause, which, as my panelist Kara Gross tells us, is the clause in the First Amendment that guarantees that American law can't prefer one religion over another, and that these lawyers advocated for an absolute separation between church and state, and argued that American Jews would fare best in a nation that was entirely free of religious influence. Now, on some level, this might seem like an odd position for Jewish leaders to take, since at least in the American context, Jews generally organize themselves as a religious group. So on some level, right, like advocating for a strict separation of church and state seemed to undermine American Jews' own ability to influence public policy as religious citizens of the country. But Jewish lawyers adopted this strategy because they were very aware of their lack of power in relation to the Christian majority. And they understood that within American law, religion didn't mean every religion, that religion most often meant Christianity. And so they believed that any religious influence in American law would result not in shared power and religious pluralism, but rather in coercive forms of Christianity. And so they witnessed, and of course they witnessed this happening, for instance, when Jewish children in public schools were forced to say the Lord's Prayer and to participate in Christmas pageants. And those are just some examples of the kind of coercive Christianity that happened in American history. So the lawyers of an organization called the American Jewish Congress, which at the time was a very influential American Jewish organization, very strong legal arm, they were at the forefront of fighting for the establishment clause and the separation of church and state, often in conjunction with the ACLU. And their lawyers successfully litigated many religious establishment cases relating to prayer in public schools, and state aid to parochial schools and religious symbols on public property. So, for instance, they were very influential in making it illegal for US courtrooms to hang crosses on their walls, or for public schools to force children to say Christian prayers, to recite Christian prayer. So when these lawyers from the American Jewish Congress first tried to protect abortion rights back in 1976, they approached it as a church and state issue. And this makes sense because this was their bread and butter. This is what they did, right? So they saw it through the lens of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And what happened was that in 1976, Congress was debating the first Hyde Amendment, which prevented public healthcare programs like Medicaid from funding abortions. And when the House of Representatives was debating passing this amendment, they actually consulted with the American Jewish Congress. And their lawyers insisted that this amendment violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment because it hinged on the notion that life began at conception, which is an idea that some conservative Christians may believe, but this is not the attitude of Jewish traditions, which largely assume that life begins at birth with a baby's first breath. So the Hyde Amendment ended up passing in spite of these objections. But the question of whether the amendment violated the Establishment Clause was hotly debated in the press, and particularly once the Supreme Court decided to test whether the Hyde Amendment was constitutional in the Harris-McRae case of 1980. And anti-abortion activists within the Christian right pointed out that American laws often aligned with religious principles, such as those laws preventing murder and theft, which were also part of the Ten Commandments. And they started to worry that if the court decided that the Hyde Amendment was unconstitutional because of established religion, that it would undermine the ability of any religious Americans to ever wield influence in the public sphere. So you could kind of see how these debates played out. And these concerns actually gave some Jewish leaders pause. Even though, most of them were strongly in favor of legal abortion, they started to wonder what impact the Harris-McRae decision might have on the ability of religious American Jews to advocate for their own interests. And so what ended up happening between 1970 and 1980 is that most American Jewish organizations, including the American Jewish Congress, decided that they would no longer argue against abortion restrictions on the grounds that they established Christianity into American law. And then, of course, that instead what they would argue, is that they violated the free exercise clause because they prevented Jewish women at the time, that they certainly thought about gender in a binary way, because they prevented Jewish women from being able to access abortion if that abortion was supported by their religious traditions. And of course, in the case of Jewish Americans, many abortions are supported by Jewish tradition. So, and then what happened was that the Harris versus McRae explicitly rejected the idea that abortion restrictions violated the Establishment Clause. So the religious exercise clause ended up being the live issue. Okay, So at that point, Jewish organizations shifted their strategy, and in 1989, the Supreme Court tested yet another set of abortion restrictions in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services. And the lawyers of the American Jewish Congress, in coalition actually with many other liberal religious groups and the ACLU, developed a different argument that again emphasized the free exercise clause of the First Amendment as the reason that abortion should never be restricted. And they submitted an amicus brief on the Webster case that argued that abortion restrictions prevented Jews and other religious citizens from turning to their own religious conscience when considering whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. Now, the Supreme Court justices in 1989 did not address this free exercise challenge. And they completely ignored it. And to this day, the Supreme Court has never explicitly addressed the issue of whether religious exemptions can be made to guarantee access to abortion. And so this history, in many ways, is what's animating current court cases right now in states like Kentucky and Indiana. Because these states are not only bound by the First Amendment of the Constitution, but they also have laws, RFRA laws, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act laws, that specifically guarantee religious free exercise to their citizens. And what Jewish plaintiffs are claiming is that abortion bans in these states prevent Jewish people from freely exercising their religion when their religion supports, or in some cases even compels them to seek abortion care. Now, if one of these cases ends up going to the Supreme Court, things are going to get really interesting, because the current court loves the free exercise clause almost as much as it hates abortion rights. The current Supreme Court has granted nearly all of the religious exemption claims made by conservative Christian plaintiffs. So if the court systematically grants conservative Christians all of their free exercise claims, but then rejects the claims of liberal Jews on this issue, then the nation is really going to have to think deeply about what the nature of religious freedom is in our country, and whether our First Amendment is actually protecting non-Christians or really anyone with a uterus. So I will leave my comments there. And once again, thanks to all of you for taking some time to think through all of this with my panelists and myself.
Thank you, Dr. Kranson. That's really interesting. There's a case in Florida. Rabbi Silver has filed a case in Florida on the same grounds. I want to go to sexuality and gender identity. Rabbi Morrison, why are LGBTQ rights related to religious freedom? How is sexuality and gender identity a religious freedom issue? And what does Judaism say about all this?
So I want to also speak to the comments that were in the chat. Of course, I represent a liberal Jewish venue, or I guess view, as a liberal Jewish woman. So I am aware that the ultra-Orthodox may not agree with my stance, but I am speaking on behalf of myself as a Reform rabbi. In terms of gender and sexual identity, I think that it is something that aligns perfectly with Judaism and with religious freedom, and government not stepping onto it. It says right at the very beginning of the Torah that we're created b'tselem Elohim l'shem Adonai, that God made us in God's image, and that however we were made is how we were supposed to be made. And so for many people, I think just as unwavering their identity as a Jew may be, it is the same for their gender and sexual identity. The idea that the government would have anything to do with how somebody identifies or who somebody sleeps with, I think is as absurd as the government have anything to do with how I believe or how you believe or don't believe. I did want to say to Kara, that was so interesting when you talked about it's not just how you pray, it's how you don't pray, right? It gives us the right to also have the absence of that. I think I remember growing up and seeing a t-shirt that said, the government has nothing to do with my uterus, and thinking, that's right. And the same goes, I think, with gender and sexual identity and orientation, as it does alongside religion. I think it is such a division between government and personal choice. And I don't believe gender and sexual identity is a choice, but I do understand that it's individualized, and that any political arm that would extend into one's gender or sexual identity is really verboten, and not just socially, but also religiously. Back to the point that I started with, we were created this way. And so I think that for the LGBTQ plus community, there's been so much alignment within the liberal Jewish community, at least. I know that over the past 5 years, I've done about 40 conversions of people who have come to Judaism within the queer community, who are looking for something to connect with and are looking for a non-judgmental look at religion. Not a "you are a sinner, you must be fixed," but this is how you were made, and you're actually perfect the way that you were made. Not to Pollyanna-ize the entire process of being Jewish and being queer, I do think it's something that we should celebrate, that gender and sexual identity and orientation is something that's celebrated within our faith, as opposed to despite our faith. So any crossing over of the government taking control of any of these aspects, with or without Judaism, I think is just, it seems honestly, and I'll use the word again, absurd. I think they are just in line with who we are and how we are. And as Kara said, how we aren't, the opposite of it, that it's really nobody's, it's personal and it's no one else's decision or opinion. It should matter.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. That touched me. I want to follow up with a question to Dr. Kranson. Kind of the fundamentalist right always insists on using the term Judeo-Christian when talking about our country's founding, sometimes when talking about what policy they're doing. Could you talk more about that? Do you feel that is, as a scholar, is that true? Is that our founding? Is there such a thing as the modern Judeo-Christian narrative?
Yeah. So I will just put out there that 99% of the time when a person uses the term Judeo-Christian, really they only mean Christian. And there's really nothing very Judeo about what they have to say. And this, I would say, is particularly true when it comes to reproductive rights, because again, no matter where a Jewish person may fall, or a Jewish leader may fall on the question of, whether and when an abortion is permissible according to Jewish law, and I'm sure, as we know, right, most liberal Jewish leaders are of the opinion that a pregnant person's life comes first. But there are more conservative Jewish leaders who say that no, really abortion should only take place in a more restricted way, only if a pregnant person's life is at stake. That doesn't matter in terms of whether this is a Judeo-Christian tradition, because no matter where that Jewish leader's position comes from, it is not coming from the same place as conservative Christians. And just to give you a little bit of kind of a background here, both Jewish and Catholic traditions developed their ideas about abortion from the book of Exodus, which talks about a case of accidental abortion. Basically, there's a case in which a man accidentally hits a woman, and again, the way Jews interpret this verse, they say that, well, if a pregnant woman and if her fetus is expelled, the man has to pay a fine. But if the woman herself is killed, then it's a capital crime, then it's murder. And again, for millennia, Jews have been interpreting this case to mean that there's a real difference between a fetus and a full life. Now, Catholics, based on a different translation of the verse, because they're coming from the Septuagint, they translate this verse completely differently. And so for them, they say that it's not, a misfortune that happens. They say it's something having to do with form, but they take this verse and based on a completely different translation say that, well, it's murder if the miscarriage happens after the moment of quickening. And then Protestants don't even look at this verse, right? Conservative Protestants, evangelicals don't even look at this verse at all when they're thinking about abortion. And again, certainly not all Protestants are anti-abortion in any way, but those who are basically use verses like in Psalms and the book of Jeremiah, which again, Jewish traditions don't look at all. They're considered to be poetry in the Jewish tradition. Jewish traditions don't look at that at all when thinking about abortion and the origin of life. So again, and this makes sense, right? Because Judaism and Christianity developed for millennia in really different ways. And to be clear, there is no single Christian tradition on abortion, right? So how could there be a Judeo-Christian tradition on abortion? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So I would really be wary of anyone who claims to be speaking for a Judeo-Christian tradition on anything, but particularly not in this case. I would even be wary of anyone who's saying they're claiming to have the Christian tradition on abortion, because Christians themselves have really different ways of looking at the issue.
I have so many questions on this, but I want to go to Ms. Gross because I want to bring in public education. You talked about it a little bit. Can you address? We haven't talked about public education much, and I really want to talk about why in our society it is important to have a public education that's free of religious coercion. Why not just teach the Bible in the school? Why not have prayer before athletic events or before class? Like, who does it hurt? And how is book banning hurting anybody? How is that a religious freedom issue? Can you speak to that?
Yes, of course. And first, I just want to say how much fun I'm having listening to the other panelists. This is just so great. I just want to talk with you all a lot after this too. But back to public education. So, yes, this is a huge issue that's going on across the country, and particularly here in Florida, as I'm sure all of our listeners know. It should go without saying that a public school, which is supported with government dollars and taxpayer money, cannot be a religious school, and that public education should be free of religious coercion or indoctrination. That should just be understood, and that is just the way that we think about these things. We think of a separation between church and state. We think of public school as public dollars, it's taxpayer dollars, it's a public education. It is not a private religious school. The two should never meet. The fundamental legal tenet of separation of church and state has long protected both the integrity of our public education system, which is supposed to serve all students, and the separation of church and state also protects the right of religious private schools to teach students in accordance with a particular faith. And that is the separation. The public schools serve all students, and the private religious schools, they teach their own faith. But what's happening is that officials, legislative officials, governors across the country and here in Florida are seeking to not only to blur those lines, but to completely eviscerate them. And it's critical that public education remain a space that is free from religious coercion, because, like I said, public schools, they are supposed to be for everyone. And if you start teaching a religious doctrine or a preferred religious doctrine, you are necessarily teaching in accordance with some students' religious beliefs and not others. You are establishing one religion over another. Students should feel free to be able to learn in an environment free of religious indoctrination and peer pressure or teacher pressure, classroom pressure, administration pressure. They should be free from those pressures to not have to espouse religious views that are not their own. This is why we don't indoctrinate students with the teaching of Bible or allow prayer in school. If you are to allow prayer in school, there are going to be some students in that classroom that may not pray that way, that may not pray at all. And they are forced then to sit there while this is happening around them. And that is coercive, and that is what our Constitution protects against. Not all students and families follow the teachings of the Bible or pray in the same way or pray at all, which is exactly why the Bible should not be taught in a public school. In contrast, it can be taught in a private religious school, and that's where it should be taught, because that is a place where religion is being taught and a place where parents are sending their kids because they believe in that religion to obtain that religious teaching. But public schools are for everybody and not for one religion over another. We are seeing a enormous evisceration of our public education system. And I think that's something, I think that there is, it should not be lost on people that the evisceration of public education in Florida and across the country is not just about public education, but it is about religious education and religious indoctrination. So what is happening in Florida, we talk a lot about voucher programs and voucher schools, but I think that phrasing kind of misses the mark, right? So what is really happening in these voucher programs and voucher schools is that public dollars, taxpayer dollars, are being diverted from public education and are being diverted to private religious schools. They're being diverted to private schools, but in Florida and in lots of places throughout the country, there are a majority of those private schools are Christian schools. I live in Tallahassee, and there are several private Christian schools and only one private non-denominational high school. So you think about all of these tax dollars across the state that are being taken from the public to fund religious educations through these voucher programs. And that is incredibly problematic and quite scary, thank you, and infringes on the religious freedom of students and families and taxpayers. Okay, I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate it. I think we should have scheduled this for 3 hours because this is a really good conversation. And I myself have about 10 questions for each of you. But I see that there's a bunch in the chat. So Paul, if you can hear me, do you want to start asking some of the participant questions?
I think several were answered by the panelists when they saw them, but the one in the Q&A is very interesting because she asked, I frequently find myself torn between wanting to speak out on troublesome issues, but at the same time not wanting to draw attention to myself and or my religious identity in a public way. Your response. And it was directed at Rabbi Morrison. I think every panelist might have an approach though.
I would love to take that one on. I will tell you, I take to heart very much the idea that we can't stand idly by. I know this is as nonpartisan as possibly we could get, but I am suing the state for the Don't Say Gay. I'm one of the plaintiffs in the Don't Say Gay case. I knew as a queer mom, my kid could no longer talk in Miami. I'm not even in Tallahassee, in Miami, about the fact that his mom is gay and that the teachers could not ask or they could be sued. And I realized it no longer mattered exactly how I felt or if I was on the right side of history, is that I needed to stand up and speak out. And that was really about representing my Jewish self of we cannot just let things happen. So I understand that's not exactly First Amendment in that same right, but to hear Kara talk about vouchers and about, Christmas pageants, my son is regularly taught about Christianity because it's a nuanced normal, right? His teachers are Christian and most predominantly Hispanic Catholics. And the minute he says that his mom's a rabbi, it draws attention, right? As for a lot of different reasons. But when you bring up the queer aspect, it's all of a sudden shut down. And so I think that as Jews, I totally respect not wanting to draw attention to yourself or your identity, but I think we are so past being allowed to be a model minority that can fit in. I don't assume anybody's color of their skin or what anybody looks like on this call, but for a long time, Jews have been able to pass as Christian Americans. And I speak very often from the pulpit, from the Bema, that although we can pass, we are commanded not to try and pass. We must speak up. So I understand and I empathize with your concern. And yet on the other hand, I practice what I preach. And I think that we have to be out there and be loud, but also loud and proud. And third, educated. I think that if we speak from a place of lack of education, we then speak on behalf of every Jew, on behalf of every woman, in my case, on behalf of every queer woman. We have to know what we're talking about. But I think once we get that knowledge under our belt, go out there with confidence that we were born to speak out, and we would not have crossed the Red Sea had we not spoken out against our slavery. And, Jews are told, just like in that story, look behind you, see who needs some help crossing and grab for them and pull them forward, just like someone should be looking for us in their rearview mirror and help bring us forward as well. We are advocates by genetics, by choice, however you look at it. We're not allowed to just sit back.
That was fabulous. Dr. Kranson,
I have a very quick answer to that, which is, part of what I'm hearing in the question, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, is a fear that if as an activist, you draw attention to your Jewish identity, that you yourself may be somehow in violation of the separation of church and state. And let me just be clear that the Establishment Clause and the separation of church and state is incumbent upon the government. It's our government's responsibility not to embed religion into public institutions and into our laws. It has nothing to do with activists or individual citizens. So as an individual citizen, and certainly Jews are absolutely not just allowed according to law, but it is wonderful for Jewish people to be activists within the public sphere. And certainly, as we know, conservative Christians have been active in the public sphere very successfully for decades now. And so if you disagree with some of what they've been advocating for, then I would say those religious individuals who have very different ideas about what it means to be a religious person seeking justice, that it's really important politically for left-leaning religious activists to be in the public sphere representing their very different ideas about what it might mean to be a justice-seeking person of religious conviction.
And I'll just add also to that, because what I get questions like that a lot too, and a lot of times it's from people feeling a fear of retaliation right now too, which is very real from lots of different corners. But I guess if that's part of the question that you're asking as well, one of the things that I might say is that speaking out can take many forms. So one way is, speaking out loudly with a bullhorn at a protest. Another way could be speaking out through who you are voting for at a voting booth. Another way is who you are supporting financially. when it comes time to make donations and decisions like that. So there's ways that you can speak out that might make you feel more comfortable and less exposed.
I would add also speaking to your family, who you love, and trying to come from a place of common ground and moving forward. Paul, did you have? I have a question for everybody, but is there another chat?
Yeah, there's a couple of good ones now in the Q&A. One is because Rabbi Morrison referenced "Don't Say Gay." There's kind of an explanation for some background on that, because even though it's been in the news a lot, we might need a quick explainer of what that's all about. And I'll just ask the second one too, which is, what are your thoughts about the pervasive use of the phrase "In God We Trust" across courtroom walls and on currency, etc.? I think Kara may be able to talk to this as well, because it's kind of the battles that we've lost in the past, right? About where God appears on our currency, etc. So maybe we start with the "Don't Say Gay" and then go to the God on our currency.
So I have learned one big thing, because it is still an active case. I'm going to let Kara discuss "Don't Say Gay."
What I'll say about it, so I'm not sure about the context that folks are looking for, but in the biggest picture frame, the "Don't Say Gay" bill was passed, not this session, but the session before, and it basically made it so that you couldn't have conversations in K through basically 8th, but particularly K through 3 with regards to sexual orientation and gender identity. It made it impossible for teachers to be able to teach about those subjects. And that the language was so vague and broad that it would make it difficult for people to feel comfortable talking about whether or not they have same-sex parents, or whether or not they have a sibling who's gay, or whether or not they are gay themselves. So it made it impossible to talk about individuals' lived experiences, their family, history, all of those things. Very terrible law. There's been legal challenges. And then this session, they expanded upon that incredibly devastating law. You couldn't think it could get any worse, and they made it worse by basically expanding it all the way through high school, although the language is such that it could have been interpreted that far along before as well. But you're not allowed to talk about, you are prohibited from talking about gender identity or sexual orientation before high school. And then after high school, you can't talk about it in a way that seems inappropriate, whatever that means, according to whoever decides that, which is not you. So it also has a lot of other terrible provisions in it, preventing teachers from referring to students by their preferred pronouns, even if those are the pronouns that the parents have asked the teacher to use, and lots of other terrible provisions in it as well. So that's the "Don't Say Gay" or "Don't Say LGBTQ" bills that have been passed the last 2 sessions.
I just want to add one thing. It says the non-normative. So in terms of when we're talking about Judeo-Christian, and we see that very much as Christian, it is completely up to who decides what is normal. In this sense, heteronormative. And so anyone non-heteronormative in their vocabulary or identity then is going against what this law is saying.
And then the question about, one nation under God, or in God we trust, in the classrooms and in courtrooms.
Yeah, so that, again, that's an excellent point. And just as you said, it's on our dollar bills. It's, as of, I think 2 sessions ago, it's required to be in every school in a visible place. So, again, this is just another example of the normalizing of the church within and of specific religions within our society, even though our Constitution is supposed to be keeping government out of these decisions.
Okay, I am going to have to call it. It is 7:31. I have several really great questions about justifications for interpretation of abortion, talking about more LGBTQ issues, book banning. What I'm going to say is please come to our webinar on October 17th. We're going to really dig down on these issues and we will be discussing them. It's just been a fascinating conversation and I'm really looking forward to continuing it on the 17th. I want to thank everyone, Kara Gross, Dr. Kranson, Rabbi Amy Morrison. In addition to the webinar we have on the 17th, we also are going to be having a webinar on highlighting reproductive rights and the ballot initiatives in Florida and Ohio and Arizona on September 13th at 7:30 p.m. I will be sending all this information out to everyone who is in Florida and Georgia and maybe the Carolinas. Please stay safe. And again, appreciate everyone for giving your time and coming here. And thank you and have a wonderful night, everyone. Good night.